The Oklahoma sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt as Garth Brooks pulled his black pickup truck into the dusty driveway of the old family farm. The weathered wooden sign that once proudly displayed Brooks Family Ranch now hung askew, its paint peeling like old skin. He hadn't been back to Tulsa County in 15 years, not since his mother Martha's funeral. Now, with his father Raymond's recent passing, the weight of inheritance and responsibility had finally drawn him home. Garth stepped out of the truck, his worn cowboy boots crunching on the gravel. The familiar scent of dry grass and distant cattle filled his nostrils, triggering a flood of childhood memories. The two-story farmhouse stood before him like a ghost from his past, its once white paint now a weathered gray, shutters hanging loose on rusted hinges. The wraparound porch, where he'd spent countless evenings learning guitar from his father, sagged under the weight of neglect. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, removing his black Stetson and running a hand through his graying hair. At 55, success had treated him well, but standing here in the shadow of his childhood home, he felt every one of those years weighing on his shoulders. The screen door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through grimy windows. Everything was exactly as Raymond had left it. The faded family photographs lining the mantel, the old upright piano in the corner, sheet music scattered across its top. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there during his childhood, an overwhelming sense of secrets lingering in the stale air. Garth walked slowly through the living room, his fingers trailing along the back of his father's worn leather recliner. Raymond Brooks had seemed so much larger than life when Garth was young. A stern but loving man who'd taught him everything about music, about hard work, about being a man. But in his final years, there had been a distance between them, an unspoken tension that Garth had never understood. "I'm sorry I wasn't here at the end, Dad," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry for a lot of things." He climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, each step groaning under his weight. His old bedroom remained untouched, the walls still covered with faded posters of Hank Williams and Johnny Cash. His first guitar, a beat-up acoustic with a crack down the front, leaned against the wall where he'd left it decades ago. He picked it up, strumming a few chords, the familiar feel of the strings under his fingers bringing back memories of late nights spent writing songs and dreaming of Nashville. But it was his parents' bedroom that held the most surprises. Raymond had been a meticulous man, but the room was in complete disarray. Dresser drawers hung open, their contents spilled across the floor. Papers were scattered everywhere, as if someone had been searching for something specific. Garth frowned, kneeling down to examine the mess more closely. Among the scattered documents, he found old bank statements, medical records, and yellowed newspaper clippings. But it was a small, leather-bound journal that caught his attention. The cover was worn smooth, and "Property of Martha Brooks" was embossed in fading gold letters. His mother's journal. He'd never known she kept one. With trembling hands, he opened to the first page. The date was July 15, 1962, 2 years before his birth. His mother's elegant handwriting filled the pages, and as he read, his world began to shift beneath his feet. Raymond suspects something. One entry read, "He's been asking questions about where I go on Thursday evenings. I told him it's church choir practice, but I can see the doubt in his eyes. How can I explain that I'm not going to church? How can I tell him about James? How can I tell him that for the first time in my life, I understand what it means to truly love someone?" Garth's heart pounded as he flipped through more pages, each entry revealing pieces of a story he'd never known existed. His mother. The woman he'd always seen as the perfect pastor's wife had been having an affair. But it wasn't just any affair. As he read further, the details became more shocking. "James played for me tonight," another entry read. His fingers move across those piano keys like he's painting music in the air. When he sings, it's like he's reaching into my soul and pulling out feelings I didn't know I had. I know what people would say if they knew. I know what they'd do to him. But I can't stop myself. I can't stop loving him. The blood drained from Garth's face as he continued reading. James wasn't just any man. The journal made it clear that James Mitchell was a black musician who played at the local juke joint on the other side of town, in the part of Tulsa that white folks weren't supposed to visit. In 1962, Oklahoma, such a relationship wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, Garth found himself completely absorbed in his mother's secret life. The journal painted a picture of a passionate, forbidden love affair that had lasted for months. Martha wrote about stolen moments in hidden places, about the music James shared with her, about dreams of running away together to California where nobody would know them. But the entries grew darker as they progressed. There were mentions of threats, of someone finding out, of James becoming increasingly worried about their safety. The final entry was dated November 3, 1963, just a few months before Garth's birth. "They found out," the entry read in Martha's increasingly frantic handwriting. "Someone saw us together last Thursday. James says we have to stop seeing each other, that it's too dangerous now. He's talking about leaving town, heading north where things might be different. My heart is breaking, but I know he's right. Still, I can't let him go without telling him the truth. I can't let him leave without knowing about the baby." Garth dropped the journal, his hands shaking. The baby. Could it be possible? He quickly calculated the dates. If his mother had been pregnant in November 1963, and he'd been born in February 1964, the timing was perfect, or terrible, depending on how you looked at it. He spent the rest of the afternoon searching through the scattered papers, looking for more clues. In a shoebox hidden under the bed, he found old photographs, pictures of his mother with a tall, handsome black man who could only be James Mitchell. They were clearly in love, their faces glowing with happiness in the faded color photographs. There was something about James's eyes, about the way he held his head, that seemed familiar to Garth, though he couldn't place why. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old pillowcase, he found a birth certificate. His birth certificate. But this wasn't the one he'd always known about. This was an original. And in the space marked Father, instead of Raymond Brooks, someone had written James Mitchell in careful script before crossing it out and writing Raymond Brooks over it. Garth sank onto his parents' bed, the weight of the discovery crushing down on him. Raymond Brooks, the man who'd raised him, taught him guitar, and shown him what it meant to be a country musician, wasn't his biological father. His real father was a black man named James Mitchell, who had disappeared from Tulsa County over 40 years ago. As darkness fell over the farm, Garth sat alone in the living room, staring at the journal and photographs spread out on the coffee table before him. His entire life, his entire identity, had been built on a lie. He thought about all the times Raymond had talked about family heritage, about the Brooks family legacy, about blood and belonging. None of it was true. But more than that, he thought about James Mitchell. What had happened to him? Had he really left town? Or had something worse occurred? In 1963, Oklahoma, a black man involved with a white woman could face violence, even death. The thought made Garth's stomach churn. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at the name Sarah Palmer. Sarah was a local historian and genealogist who'd helped him research his family tree for a song he'd written years ago. If anyone could help him find out what had happened to James Mitchell, it would be her. "Sarah, it's Garth Brooks. I know it's late, but I need your help with something. It's about my family history and it's complicated." Sarah's voice was groggy but interested. "Garth, of course. I'll help however I can. What's going on?" "I'm at the old family farm, and I've found some documents that suggest my father might not be who I thought he was. There's a man named James Mitchell, and I need to know what happened to him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "James Mitchell? From Tulsa County? Garth, that's a name I haven't heard in a very long time. Meet me at the library tomorrow morning. There are some things about James Mitchell you need to know, and they're not good things." After hanging up, Garth walked out onto the front porch, the journal still clutched in his hands. The Oklahoma night was clear and cool, stars visible despite the distant glow of Tulsa's lights. He sat down on the porch steps where he'd spent so many evenings as a child, listening to Raymond play guitar and tell stories about the old days. Now those stories felt hollow, tainted by lies and secrets. But as he opened the journal again and read more of his mother's words, he began to understand that the truth was more complicated than simple deception. Martha hadn't been trying to hurt anyone. She'd been a young woman who'd fallen in love at a time and place where that love was forbidden. "Who were you, James Mitchell?" he whispered into the night air. "And what really happened to you?" As if in answer to his question, a warm breeze rustled through the old oak trees surrounding the farmhouse, carrying with it the faint sound of music, a blues melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth itself. Garth shivered, though the night wasn't cold, and for a moment he could swear he heard the sound of piano keys dancing on the wind. Tomorrow, he would begin the search for answers. Tomorrow, he would start uncovering the truth about James Mitchell and the secret that had shaped his entire life. But tonight, he sat alone on his childhood porch, holding his mother's journal and listening to ghost music carry across the Oklahoma plains, wondering if he was ready for what he might discover. The stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to secrets buried for generations, as Garth Brooks prepared to dig up the truth about his past, no matter how painful it might be. The Tulsa County Public Library smelled of old books and industrial carpet when Garth arrived the next morning. Sarah Palmer was already waiting for him at a corner table, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her reading glasses perched on her nose. Spread before her were several manila folders, old newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be police reports. "You look like hell, Garth," Sarah said without preamble as he approached the table. "Didn't sleep much, I'm guessing." Garth slumped into the chair across from her, placing his mother's journal on the table. "Found this yesterday, along with some other things. Sarah, I think James Mitchell might be my biological father." Sarah's expression grew grave as she nodded slowly. "I was afraid you might say something like that. I spent most of the night going through the archives, and what I found—" She pushed one of the folders toward him. "James Mitchell wasn't just any musician, Garth. He was something special." Garth opened the folder to find newspaper clippings from the early 1960s. The headlines made his blood run cold. "Local Negro musician missing. Search continues for James Mitchell." And finally, "Body found in creek, identified as missing musician." "He's dead?" Garth's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Found in Turkey Creek, about 3 miles from town in December 1963. Sarah confirmed, her voice heavy with sorrow. Official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, but she pulled out another clipping. There were rumors. Lots of rumors. The article Sarah showed him was from a small black newspaper that had operated in Tulsa during the 1960s. The headline read, Another lynching covered up? See, and the story that followed painted a very different picture of James Mitchell's death. According to several unnamed sources, James had been receiving threats for weeks before his disappearance. His car had been found abandoned on a back road, and there were signs of a struggle. The black community knew what really happened, Sarah explained. But in 1963, their voices didn't carry much weight with the sheriff's department. The case was closed quickly, ruled an accident, and that was that. Garth studied the photographs that accompanied the articles. James Mitchell had been a handsome man in his 20s, with intelligent eyes and strong hands. There was something achingly familiar about his face, and Garth realized with a start that he was looking at features he recognized from his own mirror. The shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the way he held his head. "Tell me about him," Garth said quietly. "Tell me about the man who might have been my father." Sarah's expression softened as she pulled out more documents. James Mitchell was born in 1938 in the Greenwood district, what they used to call Black Wall Street before the massacre in 1921. His family lost everything in that riot, but they rebuilt. James was incredibly talented, could play piano like he was born to it, had a voice that could make you cry. He started playing professionally when he was 16, mainly at clubs in the black section of town. She showed him a photograph of James sitting at a piano, his fingers poised over the keys, a look of complete concentration on his face. By 1962, he was getting attention from some record labels up north. There was talk of him moving to Chicago or Detroit, maybe making it big. But then he met my mother, Garth finished. According to my research, they met at a church. Sarah consulted her notes. There was a community outreach program where the white churches and black churches were supposed to work together on some charity drive. Very progressive for the time. Martha was there representing her husband's congregation, and James was there with his church group. They started talking about music and fell in love, Garth said, thinking of the passion he'd read in his mother's journal entries. "It was dangerous from the start," Sarah continued. "This was Oklahoma in 1962, remember? Jim Crow was still in full effect. A relationship between a white woman and a black man wasn't just socially unacceptable, it could get you killed. And apparently, it did." Sarah pulled out one final document, a handwritten letter on police department letterhead. This is from Detective William Harper, the officer who investigated James's disappearance. He retired in the 1980s and died a few years ago. But before he passed, he gave this to his daughter with instructions to make it public if anyone ever came asking about the James Mitchell case. Garth took the letter with trembling hands and began to read, "To whom it may concern. I have carried the burden of this secret for 25 years, and I cannot take it to my grave." James Mitchell did not drown accidentally in Turkey Creek. He was murdered by persons unknown, though I have my suspicions about who was responsible. On the night of November 15, 1963, I received a call about a disturbance on the Old Mill Road. When I arrived, I found James Mitchell's car abandoned, the windows smashed, blood on the seats. I followed a trail of blood and disturbed earth to Turkey Creek, where I found James's body weighted down with stones. He had been beaten severely before being thrown in the water. I was told by my superior, Sheriff Coleman Watson, to rule it an accidental drowning. When I protested, I was threatened with losing my job and worse. I had a family to feed, so I kept quiet. But James Mitchell deserved better. He was a good man who died for the crime of loving the wrong woman. May God forgive us all. Detective William Harper. Garth sat in stunned silence, the letter in his hands feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His biological father, for he was now certain that's what James Mitchell was, had been murdered, lynched for the crime of falling in love with a white woman. with his mother. "There's more," Sarah said gently. James left behind some recordings. Amateur stuff mostly, recorded on an old reel-to-reel machine. His nephew, Marcus Mitchell, still lives in Tulsa. He's got them. "Marcus Mitchell," Garth repeated. "My cousin?" "Half-cousin, technically. James had a younger brother, Robert, who was Marcus's father. Robert passed away in the 1990s, but Marcus is still around. He's a music teacher at the local high school. I took the liberty of calling him this morning." Sarah handed him a slip of paper with a phone number written on it. "He wants to meet you." The weight of everything he'd learned in the past 24 hours threatened to crush Garth. His entire identity had been built on a foundation of lies and secrets. The man he'd called father his whole life wasn't his biological parent. His real father had been murdered for loving his mother. And now he had family he'd never known existed. "Sarah," he said finally, "what else did you find out about the men who might have killed James? Are any of them still alive?" Sarah's expression grew even more serious. "That's where things get complicated, Garth. I did some digging into who might have been involved. There were rumors about a group of men who called themselves the Protectors of White Virtue, basically a small-time KKK offshoot. 3 names came up consistently in connection with James's murder: Carl Brewster, Tommy Morrison, and..." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "And who?" Garth pressed. "And Raymond Brooks." The words hit Garth like a physical blow. Raymond was involved in James's murder? "It's just rumors and speculation," Sarah said quickly. Nothing was ever proven, but several witnesses mentioned seeing Raymond's truck in the area that night. And there's the fact that he married your mother just 3 months after James disappeared, despite the fact that she was clearly pregnant with another man's child. Garth stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. The library suddenly felt too small, too confining. He needed air, needed space to process what he'd just learned. Not only had his biological father been murdered, but the man who'd raised him might have been involved in the killing. "I need to see Marcus Mitchell," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need to hear those recordings." "Garth, are you sure you're ready for this? Once you start down this path, there's no going back. Your life, your understanding of everything, is going to change." Garth looked down at the journal, the photographs, the police report. "It's already changed, Sarah. I just need to know the truth now. All of it." An hour later, Garth was driving through a part of Tulsa he'd rarely visited as a child. The Greenwood district had been rebuilt after the 1921 massacre, but urban renewal and highway construction in the 1960s and 70s had taken their toll. Still, there were signs of the vibrant community that had once thrived here. Historic markers, murals, and small businesses that spoke to the area's rich cultural heritage. Marcus Mitchell lived in a modest brick house on a tree-lined street. He was waiting on the front porch when Garth pulled up, a man in his 50s with graying temples and kind eyes. There was something about his bearing, his way of holding himself, that reminded Garth of the photographs of James. "Mr. Brooks," Marcus said, extending his hand as Garth approached. "I have to say, this is surreal. I've been listening to your music for years, never knowing we might be family. Call me Garth, please, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this myself." Marcus led him into the house, which was filled with musical instruments and framed photographs of various family members. On the mantel, Garth spotted a large portrait of a young James Mitchell, dressed in a suit and tie, sitting at a piano. "That was taken just a few months before he died," Marcus said, following Garth's gaze. He was so excited about the future, about the possibility of making records up north. He had no idea what was coming. They sat in Marcus's living room, and Marcus pulled out a cardboard box filled with old reel-to-reel tapes and sheet music. Uncle James was always recording things, always writing new songs. After he died, my father kept all his stuff. When Dad passed, it came to me. I've been the keeper of the family history ever since. Marcus set up an old reel-to-reel player and threaded one of the tapes. This is from the summer of 1963, a few months before he disappeared. He was working on some new material, stuff that was different from what he usually played. The music that filled the room was unlike anything Garth had ever heard. James Mitchell's voice was rich and soulful, with a depth of emotion that seemed to reach right into Garth's chest and squeeze his heart. But it was the lyrics that really got to him. Love ain't supposed to be easy. Love ain't supposed to be safe. But when I hold you in the darkness, I forget about time and place. They can take away my freedom. They can take away my name, but they can't take away this feeling, this love that sets my soul aflame. He wrote that about a woman, Marcus said quietly. Never told us who she was, but we could tell she was special. He was different that summer, happier but also more worried, like he knew something good was happening but also something bad. As more songs played, Garth found himself crying quietly. The voice on the tape was his father's voice, not Raymond's, but his real father's. The man who had loved his mother so deeply that he'd risked everything for her. The man who had died for that love. There's something else, Marcus said when the tape ended. Uncle James left behind some personal items, things he asked my father to keep safe, in case anything happened to him. He handed Garth a small wooden box. He said if he ever had a son, these should go to him. Inside the box, Garth found a silver harmonica, worn smooth from years of playing. There were also several sheets of handwritten music, songs that James had apparently been working on before his death. At the bottom of the box was a letter, yellowed with age, addressed simply to my son. With shaking hands, Garth unfolded the letter and began to read. If you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and you are old enough to know the truth about who you are. Your mother, Martha, is the most beautiful woman I have ever known. Not just in her looks, but in her soul. She loves you more than life itself, and I know she will raise you to be a good man, even if I am not there to help. I want you to know that you were created in love, real love, the kind that people write songs about. Your mother and I knew the risks, knew what could happen if people found out about us, but we couldn't help ourselves. Love like ours doesn't come along very often, and when it does, you have to grab hold of it, even if it scares you. I hope you inherit your mother's kindness and your father's love of music. I hope you grow up in a world where love is judged by its truth, not by the color of the people feeling it. And I hope that somehow, some way, the music I leave behind will find its way to you. Be proud of who you are, son. Be proud of the love that made you. And if you ever get the chance, sing the songs I never got to finish. All my love, James Mitchell, your father. By the time Garth finished reading, both he and Marcus were crying. The letter was like a message from beyond the grave, a father's love reaching across 40 years to touch his son's heart. He knew, Garth whispered, he knew about me, and he knew he might not live to see me born. Uncle James was smart, Marcus said. He could see which way the wind was blowing. The threats were getting worse, and people were talking. He must have known his time was running out. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through James's belongings and listening to more recordings. With each song, each story Marcus told about his uncle, Garth felt a connection growing to the man who had given him life. James Mitchell had been talented, passionate, and brave. perhaps too brave for his own good. As the sun began to set, Garth knew he had to make a decision. He could walk away now, accept what he'd learned, and try to move on with his life. Or he could dig deeper, try to find out exactly what had happened to James and who was responsible. The thought of Raymond Brooks, the man who had raised him, taught him guitar, and shaped his understanding of music and manhood, potentially being involved in his biological father's murder was almost too much to bear. But the truth was the truth, no matter how painful. "Marcus," he said finally, "I need to know exactly what happened that night. In November 1963. I need to know who killed James, and I need to know why Raymond Brooks married my mother 3 months later." Marcus nodded gravely. "I've been waiting 40 years for someone to ask those questions. Uncle James deserves justice, even if it comes late." "Then let's find it," Garth said, clutching his father's letter to his chest. "Let's find the truth, whatever it costs." As they made plans to continue the investigation, Garth couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover secrets that would change not just his own life, but the lives of everyone involved. The truth had a way of demanding payment for the years it had been buried, and he sensed that payment was going to be steep. But James Mitchell had been his father, and fathers deserved to have their stories told, their murders solved, and their memories honored. Whatever it took, Garth was going to make sure that happened. The Oklahoma State Archives building in Oklahoma City was a fortress of concrete and glass that housed decades of official records, court documents, and police files. Garth had driven down from Tulsa with Marcus Mitchell, both men determined to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding James's death. Sarah Palmer had given them the names of several contacts who might be able to help them access records that weren't part of the public collection. "Remember," Marcus said as they walked through the building's lobby, "we're looking for anything that might connect Raymond Brooks to the murder. Police reports, witness statements, anything that might have been buried or overlooked." Dr. Amanda Hayes, the archives director, met them in a small conference room lined with filing cabinets. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and silver hair, and she'd agreed to help them after Sarah had explained the situation. "I've pulled everything I could find related to the James Mitchell case," she said, gesturing to several boxes stacked on the table. "But I have to warn you, a lot of records from that era are either missing or heavily redacted. There was a systematic effort in the 1970s to clean up files that might be embarrassing to certain prominent families." Garth and Marcus spent the morning going through box after box of documents. Most of what they found confirmed what they already knew. James had been found dead in Turkey Creek, officially ruled an accidental drowning, case closed. But buried in the paperwork, they began to find inconsistencies and gaps that suggested a cover-up. "Look at this," Marcus said, holding up a witness statement. "This is from Willie Johnson, who worked at the gas station on Mill Road. He says he saw 3 men in a truck harassing James on the night he disappeared. But look at the date on this statement. It's from 2 weeks after the body was found, but it's filed like it came in on the day of the incident." Garth examined the document. The witness described seeing James Mitchell's car being forced off the road by a pickup truck carrying 3 white men. Willie Johnson had been too far away to see faces clearly, but he'd noted the truck's license plate number. However, that information had been redacted from the file with heavy black ink. "Someone didn't want that license plate number to become public knowledge," Dr. Hayes observed. "Let me see if I can find the original intake log from that date." While she searched, Garth and Marcus continued going through the files. They found medical examiner reports that described injuries inconsistent with accidental drowning. Broken ribs, fractured skull, defensive wounds on James's hands. All of this had been noted by the coroner, but somehow hadn't made it into the official cause of death determination. "Here we go," Dr. Hayes said, returning with a thick ledger. This is the original police intake log from November 1963. Let's see. Mitchell, James, reported missing November 16th. Body found November 28th. And here's the witness statement from Willie Johnson. Filed December 12th. She ran her finger down the page. And here's the license plate number he reported. Oklahoma plates, OB 4471. Garth felt his stomach drop. OB 4471. Can you check who that was registered to? Dr. Hayes disappeared again, returning 20 minutes later with a grim expression and a single sheet of paper. The truck was registered to Raymond Brooks of Tulsa County, listed as a 1959 Ford F-100, blue and white. The evidence was right there in black and white. Raymond Brooks's truck had been at the scene of James Mitchell's disappearance. The man who had raised Garth, who had taught him everything he knew about music and life, had been involved in his biological father's murder. Marcus reached over and squeezed Garth's shoulder. "I'm sorry, man. I know this isn't easy. There has to be more," Garth said, his voice hollow. If Raymond was there, who were the other two men? And why did he do it? They continued searching through the files, and gradually, more pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. They found a series of incident reports from the weeks leading up to James's disappearance. Reports of harassment, threatening phone calls, and vandalism at the club where James played. Several witnesses mentioned seeing the same blue and white Ford truck at multiple incidents. In a file marked confidential, which Dr. Hayes admitted she probably shouldn't be showing them, they found something that made the picture even clearer. It was a report from an FBI informant who had infiltrated the local Ku Klux Klan chapter. The report, dated January 1964, mentioned a conversation the informant had overheard about a problem that had been taken care of in November. According to this, Dr. Hayes read, the informant heard three men bragging about teaching that uppity nigger musician a lesson. The men were identified as Carl Brewster, Thomas Morrison, and Raymond Brooks. They claimed they'd only meant to scare him, but things got out of hand. Garth stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the Oklahoma City skyline. Everything he'd believed about his childhood, about the man who had raised him, was crumbling. Raymond Brooks hadn't just been involved in James Mitchell's murder. He'd been part of a KKK lynching. "Garth," Marcus said quietly, "there's something else you need to see." Reluctantly, Garth returned to the table. Marcus had found a manila envelope marked Personal Effects, J. Mitchell. Inside were the items that had been found with James's body, including a small notebook that had somehow survived its time in the creek. The notebook was water-damaged and barely legible, but they could make out enough to understand its contents. It was a journal, similar to Martha's, detailing James's relationship with a white woman he referred to only as M. The final entry, dated November 15, 1963, was chilling. "Got another threatening call today. They know about M and me. Willie at the gas station warned me that some men were asking questions about where I live, where I play. I should leave town, but I can't go yet. M told me yesterday that she's carrying my child. My child. How can I leave now? But how can I stay? If something happens to me, I hope someday my child will know that their father loved them enough to risk everything." "He knew," Garth whispered. "He knew he was in danger. But he stayed because of me, because my mother was pregnant. And Raymond Brooks knew it too," Marcus added grimly. "Think about it. Raymond married your mother 3 months after James disappeared. That wasn't a coincidence. He knew she was pregnant with another man's child, a black man's child, and he married her anyway. Why would he do that unless he felt guilty," Garth finished. "Unless he was trying to cover up what he'd done. Dr. Hayes pulled out one final document from the bottom of the box. "There's one more thing. This is a marriage certificate for Raymond Brooks and Martha Collins, dated February 14, 1964. But look at this." She pointed to a notation in the margin. "There's a note here from the county clerk. It says, 'Rushed ceremony. Bride visibly pregnant. Groom insisted on immediate processing despite standard waiting period.'" "Valentine's Day," Garth said bitterly. "How romantic. Raymond Brooks marries the pregnant girlfriend of the man he helped murder." They spent another hour going through the remaining documents, but they had found the core of the truth. Raymond Brooks, along with Carl Brewster and Thomas Morrison, had been part of a KKK-affiliated group that had murdered James Mitchell in November 1963. Whether they had intended to kill him or just scare him was unclear, but the result was the same. And then, consumed by guilt, or perhaps by a genuine desire to protect Martha and her unborn child, Raymond had married her and raised Garth as his own son. As they prepared to leave the archives, Dr. Hayes pulled Garth aside. "There's something else you should know. Carl Brewster died in a car accident in 1978, and Thomas Morrison had a heart attack in 1995. But before Morrison died, he made a deathbed confession to his pastor. I have a contact at the church who might be willing to share what Morrison said." "What kind of confession?" Garth asked. "According to my contact, Morrison admitted to being involved in the murder of a black musician in the 1960s. He said it had haunted him his whole life, that they'd only meant to scare the man, but things had gotten out of control. He mentioned the other men involved by name, including Raymond Brooks. Including Raymond Brooks. The drive back to Tulsa was mostly silent, both men lost in their own thoughts. The evidence was overwhelming. Raymond Brooks had been involved in James Mitchell's murder. But as the Oklahoma countryside rolled by outside the truck windows, Garth found himself struggling with conflicting emotions. Yes, Raymond had been part of a terrible crime, but he had also raised Garth with love and patience, had taught him everything he knew about music, had been present for every important moment of his childhood. How could the same man who had helped kill his biological father also be the man who had sung him to sleep and taught him his first guitar chords? "Penny for your thoughts," Marcus said, as they neared the Tulsa city limits. "I keep thinking about something Raymond used to say to me when I was a kid," Garth replied. "He'd tell me that every man has to carry the weight of his choices, good and bad. That the measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes, but whether he tries to make up for them. You think marrying your mother was his way of making up for killing your father? Maybe. Or maybe he genuinely fell in love with her. Hell, maybe both." Garth shook his head. "I don't know what to think anymore, Marcus. Everything I thought I knew about my life has been turned upside down." They decided to visit Morrison's former pastor, Reverend David Patterson, who now lived in a retirement home on the outskirts of Tulsa. Reverend Patterson was in his 80s, confined to a wheelchair, but still sharp as a tack. When they explained who they were and what they were looking for, his face grew grave. "Tommy Morrison," he said, shaking his head sadly. "That man carried a terrible burden for 30 years. He came to see me just before he died. Wanted to make things right with God before he went." "What did he tell you?" Garth asked. "He told me about a night in November 1963 when he and 2 other men did something they could never take back. They'd been drinking," he said, "and they'd heard talk about a black musician who was involved with a white woman. They decided to teach him a lesson." Reverend Patterson paused, his roomy eyes distant with memory. "Tommy said they found the man driving home from work that night. They forced him off the road, dragged him out of his car. They just meant to rough him up, scare him into leaving town. But the man fought back. and things escalated. Carl Brewster had a tire iron, and in the heat of the moment, he killed him, Marcus said quietly. Tommy said it happened so fast. 1 minute the man was fighting, the next he was on the ground, not breathing. They panicked, decided to make it look like an accident, threw him in the creek with some rocks tied to his body. Tommy said he never slept well again after that night. Did he mention Raymond Brooks specifically? Garth asked. He did. Said Raymond was the one who came up with the plan to make it look like an accident. But he also said Raymond was the most torn up about what had happened. Apparently, Raymond knew the dead man's girlfriend, knew she was pregnant. Tommy said Raymond married her a few months later. Said he felt responsible for making sure she was taken care of. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Raymond Brooks had been involved in James Mitchell's murder, but he'd also been the one most affected by the guilt. Marrying Martha hadn't just been about covering up the crime. It had been his way of trying to atone for what he'd done. Reverend, Garth said carefully, did Morrison say anything else about Raymond's relationship with Martha? Did he know that the baby she was carrying was James Mitchell's? Reverend Patterson nodded slowly. Tommy said Raymond knew the child wasn't his, but he didn't care. Said Raymond told him once that raising that boy was the only good thing that had come out of the whole terrible situation. That maybe if he could give the child a good life, it would balance the scales somehow. As they left the retirement home, Garth felt emotionally drained. The truth was more complex than he'd expected. Raymond Brooks was a murderer, but he was also the man who had loved and raised Garth as his own son. He had been part of a terrible crime, but he had also spent the rest of his life trying to make amends for it. "What are you going to do now?" Marcus asked as they sat in the parking lot. "I don't know," Garth admitted. "Part of me wants to go to the police, expose the whole thing, make sure everyone knows what really happened to James. But Raymond's dead, and so are the other two. What's the point of dragging it all into the open now?" "The point is that Uncle James deserves to have his story told," Marcus said firmly. "He deserves to be remembered as more than just another black man who disappeared one night. He was a talented musician, a loving man who died for the crime of falling in love. His memory deserves better than being buried with his killer's secrets." Garth knew Marcus was right, but he also knew that exposing the truth would destroy the memory of the only father he'd ever known. People would remember Raymond Brooks not as the man who had raised a country music star, but as a member of a lynch mob. His mother's memory would be tainted too. People would question whether she had known about Raymond's involvement in James's death. As he drove back to the family farm that evening, Garth's mind was churning with difficult decisions. The sun was setting over the Oklahoma plains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. It was the kind of sunset that his father, both his fathers, in their own ways, would have found inspiring. When he reached the farmhouse, he sat on the front porch with James's journal and Raymond's old guitar, trying to make sense of everything he'd learned. The guitar felt different in his hands now, knowing what he knew about the man who had taught him to play it. But it also felt familiar, comforting, like an old friend. As darkness fell, Garth found himself picking out a melody, something sad and complex, with hints of both pain and redemption. Without really thinking about it, he began to sing. "Two fathers made me who I am today. One gave me life. One showed me the way. One died for love. One lived with shame. Both of them part of this heart I claim. How do you judge a man's whole life? By his darkest hour, or how he tried to make it right? How do you forgive the unforgivable, when love and hate both seem so real?" The song poured out of him, carrying with it all the confusion and pain and conflicted love he felt for the two men who had shaped his life. It wasn't a song he would ever record or perform. It was too personal, too raw. But it was his truth, and that was enough. As the last notes faded into the Oklahoma night, Garth made his decision. He would tell James Mitchell's story, but he would tell it in his own way, on his own terms. The full truth was too complex, too painful for a simple revelation. But the love story between James and Martha, the tragedy of a talented musician whose life was cut short by hatred and fear, that story deserved to be told. And maybe, in telling that story, he could find a way to honor both of his fathers, the one who had given him life and the one who had taught him how to live it, despite the terrible thing he had done. The stars were coming out over the old farmhouse, the same stars that had witnessed James Mitchell's last night alive and Raymond Brooks's decades of guilt-ridden fatherhood. Tomorrow, Garth would begin the difficult process of deciding how much of the truth the world needed to know. But tonight, he sat with his guitar and his conflicted heart, singing songs for the dead and trying to find peace with the living. 3 weeks had passed since Garth's meeting with Reverend Patterson, and he'd spent most of that time alone at the family farm, wrestling with what to do with the information he'd uncovered. The house felt different now. Every room held memories that were colored by his new knowledge of Raymond's guilt and his own complex parentage. He'd been avoiding phone calls from his manager, his record label, and the press. The country music world was buzzing with speculation about why Garth Brooks had suddenly canceled his tour and disappeared from public view. But he couldn't bring himself to care about any of that. His entire world had shifted, and he was still trying to find his footing. It was a humid Tuesday morning when an unexpected visitor arrived at the farm. Garth looked out the kitchen window to see a black sedan pulling into the driveway, followed by a pickup truck he didn't recognize. 2 men got out of the sedan, one young and earnest-looking, carrying a briefcase, the other older with gray hair and the bearing of someone used to authority. From the pickup emerged a woman Garth recognized immediately from old photographs. She was clearly related to the Morrison family. She had the same sharp features and pale blue eyes as Thomas Morrison in the police files. Garth met them on the front porch, unsure of what to expect. "Mr. Brooks," the older man said, extending his hand. "I'm Detective Frank Sullivan with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. This is Agent Peters from the FBI, and this is Mrs. Helen Morrison Clark, Thomas Morrison's daughter." Garth shook hands warily. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "Ma'am, we understand you've been conducting some research into the James Mitchell case from 1963, Detective Sullivan said. "We'd like to discuss what you've found." Helen Morrison Clark stepped forward, her face a mask of barely controlled emotion. "Mr. Brooks, I know what my father did. I've known for years, and I think it's time the truth came out." They sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Garth had eaten countless meals as a child, where Raymond had helped him with homework and taught him guitar chords. Now it felt like a conference table where his family's darkest secrets were being laid bare. "About 6 months ago," Agent Peters explained, "we received a letter from Mrs. Morrison Clark requesting that the James Mitchell case be reopened. She provided us with some items that belonged to her father, items that suggested his involvement in Mr. Mitchell's death." Helen reached into her purse and pulled out a small wooden box. "After my father died in 1995, I was cleaning out his attic, and I found this hidden under some floorboards. I was young when it happened, but I remember how different he became after November 1963. He started drinking heavily, became withdrawn and angry. My mother always said something had changed in him that winter, but she never knew what. She opened the box to reveal a bloody shirt, a watch, and a small notebook wrapped in plastic. The shirt was Uncle James's," she said quietly. "My father kept it all these years, like some kind of twisted trophy or reminder of what he'd done. The watch was his, too. And the notebook. She paused, her voice breaking slightly. The notebook has names and dates. Details about the murder. Detective Sullivan took the notebook and opened it carefully. According to Morrison's notes, the plan was hatched at a meeting of what they called the Christian Brotherhood, essentially a local KKK group that met at an abandoned barn outside town. The decision to target James Mitchell was made after they received reports about his relationship with a white woman. Reports? From who? Garth asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. From Raymond Brooks, Agent Peters confirmed. According to Morrison's notes, Brooks was the one who told the group about Mitchell's relationship with Martha Collins. He claimed she was being corrupted by the black musician and needed to be saved. The words hit Garth like a physical blow. Not only had Raymond been involved in the murder, he had been the one to target James in the first place. He had betrayed the man who loved Martha, the man who was the father of her unborn child. "There's more," Helen said quietly. "My father wrote that Brooks was obsessed with Martha Collins, had been for years. She was married to a preacher, considered one of the most virtuous women in the county. But Brooks wanted her for himself, and he saw James Mitchell as an obstacle to that. So the murder wasn't just about race," Garth said, understanding dawning. "It was about Raymond wanting my mother." "It was about both," Detective Sullivan confirmed. The racial aspect gave Brooks and the others justification for what they wanted to do anyway. They could tell themselves they were protecting white womanhood, defending the community, when really they were committing murder for personal gain. Agent Peters opened his briefcase and pulled out several photographs. "We've also recovered some physical evidence that supports Morrison's account. The spot where Mitchell's body was dumped has been dredged over the years for various construction projects. Some items were recovered and stored in evidence lockers, but never properly connected to the case. The photographs showed rusted metal objects, a tire iron with traces of blood still visible after 40 years, pieces of rope that had been used to weight down James's body, and fragments of clothing. The blood on the tire iron is a match for James Mitchell's blood type," Peters continued, "and we found fingerprints on the metal that matched Thomas Morrison's prints from his military service records. We also found partial prints that we believe belonged to Carl Brewster." "What about Raymond's prints?" Garth asked. "That's where things get complicated," Detective Sullivan said. "We have Morrison's testimony that Brooks was involved, but the physical evidence connecting him directly to the murder is limited. However, we do have this." He showed Garth a photograph of a truck bumper, badly corroded, but still identifiable. This was pulled from Turkey Creek in 1987 during a cleanup effort. The serial numbers identify it as coming from a 1959 Ford F-100, the same model and year as Raymond Brooks's truck. More importantly, there are traces of blue and white paint that match the description witnesses gave of the truck used in Mitchell's abduction. Helen Morrison Clark leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Mr. Brooks, I've lived with the knowledge of what my father did for almost 30 years. It's eaten away at me, knowing that a good man died and his killer was never brought to justice. When I heard you were investigating the case, I knew it was time to come forward." "Why now?" Garth asked. "Why didn't you go to the police years ago?" "Because I was scared," she admitted. "Scared of what it would do to my family's reputation, scared of what people would think, but mostly scared that no one would believe me, that it would all be covered up again like it was in 1963. But you're Garth Brooks. People will listen to you. The truth will come out if you tell it." Agent Peters closed his briefcase and looked directly at Garth. "Mr. Brooks, we have enough evidence now to posthumously charge Thomas Morrison and Carl Brewster with the murder of James Mitchell. The case will be officially reclassified as a homicide, and their names will be cleared from any records suggesting they were upstanding citizens. "What about Raymond?" Garth asked quietly. "That's more complicated," Detective Sullivan admitted. "The evidence against him is largely circumstantial, and he's been dead for years. We could include his name in the official investigation report, but without a confession or stronger physical evidence, we can't make definitive statements about his level of involvement." "But you believe he was involved? Based on everything we've seen?" "Yes, I believe Raymond Brooks was involved in James Mitchell's murder. Whether as a direct participant or as the instigator who provided information to the actual killers, he bears responsibility for what happened." After the law enforcement officers and Helen Morrison Clark left, Garth sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the copies of documents they'd left behind. The official investigation was moving forward, whether he wanted it to or not. James Mitchell's case would be reclassified as a homicide. The truth about his death would become part of the public record. But Garth still faced the personal decision of how much of his own story to tell. The world would learn that James Mitchell had been murdered by racist vigilantes, but would they learn that he had been Garth Brooks's biological father? Would they learn that the man who had raised one of country music's biggest stars had been involved in a lynching? That evening, Garth called Marcus Mitchell and asked him to come to the farm. When Marcus arrived, Garth filled him in on the day's revelations. "So, it's really happening," Marcus said when Garth finished. "Uncle James is finally going to get justice, even if it's 40 years too late." "Are you ready for what's going to come with that?" Garth asked. "Once this story breaks, there's going to be media attention, questions about our family connection, speculation about my own heritage. Your life is going to change too." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window at the Oklahoma sunset. "You know what I've been thinking about since we started this whole investigation? I've been thinking about Uncle James's music. All those songs he wrote. All that talent that was silenced because of hatred and fear. Don't you think it's time for those songs to be heard?" Garth had been thinking the same thing. Among James's belongings, they'd found dozens of original compositions. Songs that combined elements of blues, gospel, and country in ways that were ahead of their time. Music that might have changed the landscape of American popular music if James had lived to record and perform it. "I've been working on something," Garth admitted. "A way to tell James's story through his music. Not just the murder, not just the injustice, but the man himself. His talent, his love for my mother, his dreams for the future." "What are you thinking?" "An album. James Mitchell's songs, performed the way he might have performed them if he'd lived. With liner notes that tell his story, that explain who he was and what happened to him. Not sensationalized, not exploitative, just honest." Marcus's eyes lit up. "You mean you'd record Uncle James's music?" "I mean, we'd record it, together. You're his nephew, his musical heir as much as I am. And there are other musicians who should be involved too. People who can bring authenticity to the sound, who understand the musical traditions James was drawing from." They spent the rest of the evening going through James's compositions, picking out the songs that best represented his artistry and his story. There were love songs that were clearly written for Martha, protest songs that spoke to the civil rights struggle, and deeply personal pieces that revealed James's hopes and fears. One song in particular stood out, a haunting ballad called "Legacy" that James had apparently written shortly before his death. "What will they remember when I'm gone? The color of my skin or the truth in my song? Will they speak my name with love or with shame? When all that's left are the words I sang. I hope they remember the music I made, the bridges I built, and the love that I gave. I hope they remember I lived as a man who believed in tomorrow and did what he can. This is my legacy. These notes on the page, these feelings I've captured, this love and this rage, long after my voice has been silenced forever. I hope that my music will keep us together." He knew, Marcus said quietly as they finished reading the lyrics. He knew he might not survive, but he believed his music would. "Then let's make sure it does," Garth replied. "Let's make sure James Mitchell's legacy is about more than how he died. Let's make sure it's about how he lived, how he loved, and how he sang." As they made plans for the album, which they decided to call James Mitchell, The Lost Songs, Garth felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about revealing family secrets or solving a cold case murder. This was about giving voice to a silenced artist, about letting the world hear music that had been buried for 4 decades. The truth about Raymond's involvement in James's death would eventually come out. Helen Morrison Clark had made sure of that. But Garth's role in revealing that truth would be through music, through honoring the memory of his biological father, rather than simply exposing the crimes of his adoptive one. It felt right, somehow. James Mitchell had been a musician first and foremost, and music would be his memorial. The songs he'd written in secret, the melodies he'd hummed while dreaming of a better future, the harmonies he'd shared with the woman he loved. All of it would finally be heard. The album would tell the story without sensationalizing it, would honor James's memory without destroying Raymond's completely. It was a delicate balance, but Garth felt it was the right one. Some truths were too important to keep buried, but they didn't all have to be revealed with dynamite. Sometimes music could do the job more gently, more truthfully, and with more lasting impact. As Marcus prepared to leave that evening, he turned to Garth with a serious expression. "You know this is going to change everything, don't you? Once people hear Uncle James's music, once they know the story behind it, your life will never be the same." "It's already changed," Garth replied. "Finding out about James, learning what Raymond did, everything I thought I knew about myself has been turned upside down. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's time for a new chapter. Are you ready for people to know that you're James Mitchell's son?" Garth considered the question carefully. For most of his life, he'd been Raymond Brooks's boy, shaped by the values and musical traditions that Raymond had passed down to him. But now he understood that his talent, his passion for music, his way of connecting with audiences, some of that came from James Mitchell, too. He was the product of both men, for better and worse. "Yes," he said finally, "I'm ready for people to know the truth. All of it. James Mitchell deserves to have his story told, and I deserve to know who I really am." As Marcus's truck disappeared down the dusty farm road, Garth walked back into the house that had sheltered so many secrets for so many years. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of recording James Mitchell's lost songs. He would start making phone calls to musicians who could help bring James's vision to life. He would begin the delicate process of telling a story that was both deeply personal and historically important. But tonight, he sat at Raymond's old piano and played some of James's compositions, hearing in them echoes of his own musical DNA. The melodies came easily to his fingers. The harmonies felt familiar, as if he'd known these songs his whole life, without realizing it. In a way, he had. They'd been in his blood, passed down through genetics rather than teaching, waiting 40 years to be discovered and shared with the world. Now, finally, James Mitchell's music would be heard. His legacy would be more than just a cautionary tale about racism and violence. It would be a testament to the power of love, art, and the human spirit to transcend even death. The old farmhouse settled around him as he played, its walls holding the echoes of both his father's voices, both their dreams and disappointments. It had been a place of secrets for too long. Soon, it would become a place of truth, of music, and of healing. 6 months later, Nashville's historic Ryman Auditorium was packed with an unusual mix of people. Country music fans sat alongside blues and gospel enthusiasts, music historians shared rows with civil rights activists, and members of both the Brooks and Mitchell families occupied places of honor near the stage. The occasion was the premiere performance of James Mitchell, The Lost Songs, Garth's tribute album to his biological father. The album had already generated significant media attention. When Garth had announced the project 3 months earlier, he'd also revealed the truth about his parentage and the circumstances surrounding James Mitchell's death. The story had dominated entertainment news for weeks. The revelation that one of country music's biggest stars was the son of a murdered black musician had sent shockwaves through the industry and beyond. But tonight wasn't about controversy or sensation. Tonight was about music, about giving James Mitchell the concert he'd never been able to perform, about letting his voice be heard through the songs he'd left behind. Garth stood backstage, adjusting his guitar strap and trying to calm his nerves. This wasn't like any concert he'd ever given. Usually, he performed his own songs, music that came from his own experiences and emotions. Tonight, he was channeling someone else's voice, trying to honor the memory of a man he'd never met, but who had shaped his very existence. "You ready for this?" Marcus Mitchell appeared beside him, carrying his own guitar. Over the past months, Marcus had become not just a musical collaborator, but a true friend, helping Garth navigate the complex emotions of discovering his heritage while also dealing with the media scrutiny that followed. "As ready as I'll ever be," Garth replied. "How's the family holding up?" Marcus glanced toward the audience, where several elderly members of the Mitchell family sat in the front row. "They're emotional, but they're proud. Aunt Ruth hasn't stopped crying since she heard Uncle James's songs for the first time. She said it's like hearing him speak from beyond the grave." Also in the audience were Helen Morrison Clark and her family. After her father's posthumous conviction for James Mitchell's murder had been announced, Helen had become an advocate for revisiting other cold cases from the civil rights era. Her courage in coming forward had helped ensure that James's story was told truthfully and completely. The investigation had ultimately confirmed Raymond Brooks's involvement in the murder, though the details remained somewhat murky. The official report concluded that he had been the one to identify James as a target and had participated in the abduction, but may not have struck the fatal blow. It was a distinction that mattered little to Garth. Involvement was involvement, regardless of the degree. The revelation about Raymond's role had been devastating but not entirely surprising. Looking back, Garth could see signs he'd missed as a child. The way Raymond sometimes grew uncomfortable when racial issues were discussed, his occasional comments about knowing one's place, the guilt that seemed to weigh on him in his later years. But Raymond's guilt didn't erase the love he'd shown Garth or the positive influence he'd had on his musical development. Garth had come to understand that people were complex, capable of both terrible crimes and genuine redemption. Raymond had spent 30 years trying to atone for one horrible night, and in raising James's son with love and care, he had perhaps succeeded in some small way. "5 minutes, Mr. Brooks," a stagehand announced. Garth took a deep breath and walked toward the stage entrance. The concert would feature 12 of James Mitchell's songs, performed by Garth, Marcus, and a carefully selected group of musicians that included gospel singer Mavis Staples, blues guitarist Buddy Guy, and country artist Brad Paisley. Each had volunteered their time to help tell James's story through his music. As Garth walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous but respectful. The audience understood the significance of the evening. This wasn't entertainment. It was memorial service, history lesson, and celebration of artistic legacy all rolled into one. "Good evening," Garth said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustic perfection of the Ryman. 41 years ago, a man named James Mitchell was murdered in Oklahoma because he fell in love with a white woman. That woman was my mother, and James Mitchell was my biological father. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. James left behind a legacy of music, songs that were never heard, melodies that were silenced by hatred and fear. Tonight, we're going to change that. Tonight, James Mitchell's voice will finally be heard. Garth began with Legacy, the haunting ballad that had so moved him and Marcus when they first discovered it. As he sang James's words about wanting to be remembered for his music rather than the color of his skin, the emotional weight of the moment was palpable. In the front row, several members of the Mitchell family were openly weeping. The next song, Love Ain't Supposed to Be Easy, told the story of James's relationship with Martha. Garth had struggled with whether to include such personal material, but ultimately decided that the love story was as important as the tragedy that followed. James and Martha's relationship had been dangerous and forbidden, but it had also been genuine and passionate. The kind of love that transcends social barriers and creates life even in the face of death. As the evening progressed, the audience was taken on a journey through James Mitchell's artistic vision. There were protest songs that spoke to the civil rights struggle, love songs that revealed his tender side, and spirituals that showed his deep faith. The music was sophisticated and ahead of its time, blending elements of country, blues, gospel, and folk in ways that prefigured the musical innovations of the 1970s and beyond. Marcus performed several songs solo, his voice carrying echoes of his uncle's style that he'd inherited through family tradition. When he sang Mississippi Moon, a song about leaving the South for better opportunities in the North, his performance was so authentic and moving that the audience gave him a standing ovation. But it was the duet between Garth and Mavis Staples on Bridge Across the Water that provided the evening's most powerful moment. The song was James's vision of racial reconciliation, a dream of a time when color wouldn't matter and people would be judged by the content of their character rather than the shade of their skin. As their voices blended, one white and country, the other black and steeped in gospel tradition, the song became a living embodiment of James's dream. There's a bridge across the water where all God's children meet. No more talk of black and white there, just souls with hearts that beat. Someday, we'll cross that bridge together, leave the past behind, and find the love that's always been there, in the universal mind. The evening concluded with Oklahoma Wind, James's meditation on home and belonging. As Garth sang the final verses, accompanied by the full ensemble, images of James's life appeared on screens behind the stage. Photos from his childhood, pictures with his family, shots of him performing at local clubs, and finally, the photo of him with Martha that had been found in Raymond's effects. The Oklahoma wind keeps blowing across the plains I knew, and though I may be gone tomorrow, my spirit's staying true to the land that made and shaped me, to the people that I love. The Oklahoma wind will carry me to whatever waits above. As the last notes faded, the audience rose in a sustained standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. But more than appreciation for the performance, it felt like a collective acknowledgement of a life that had been cut short, a talent that had been silenced, and a story that had finally been told. After the concert, Garth and Marcus held a press conference to discuss the project and its implications. The questions ranged from the personal. How had learning about his true parentage affected Garth's sense of identity? To the historical. What did James Mitchell's story say about race relations in 1960s America? I think the most important thing people can take from this, Garth said, in response to one question, is that love transcends all the artificial barriers we create. James Mitchell and my mother loved each other despite knowing how dangerous that love was. They created life in the face of hatred. That's not a tragedy. That's a miracle. A reporter asked about Raymond Brooks and how Garth reconciled his feelings about the man who had raised him with the knowledge of his involvement in James's murder. "Raymond Brooks did a terrible thing," Garth replied carefully. "There's no excusing that, no justifying it. But he also spent 30 years trying to make amends for it by loving and raising me. I can condemn his actions while still acknowledging the good he did in his life. People are complicated. We're all capable of both great evil and great good, sometimes within the span of a single lifetime." Marcus fielded questions about the Mitchell family's response to the renewed attention to James's story. "For us, this has been about more than justice or recognition," he said. "It's been about reclaiming our uncle's legacy, making sure he's remembered as an artist and a man rather than just a victim. The music speaks for itself. Uncle James was a talent that deserved to be heard." In the weeks following the concert, James Mitchell, The Lost Songs, became both a critical and commercial success. Music critics praised the album's artistic merit and historical significance, while it climbed the charts in multiple genres: country, blues, and gospel. More importantly, it sparked conversations about race, art, and the hidden stories that shape American history. Garth donated all proceeds from the album to a scholarship fund for aspiring musicians from underrepresented communities, established in James Mitchell's name. The fund would ensure that talented young artists wouldn't be silenced by poverty or prejudice the way James had been silenced by violence. 3 months after the concert, Garth returned to the family farm in Oklahoma. The media attention had begun to die down, and he was finally able to process everything that had happened in relative quiet. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if decades of accumulated secrets had finally been released into the open air. He'd made some changes to the property. The old barn where Raymond had stored farm equipment had been converted into a small recording studio, equipped with vintage instruments that would have been familiar to James Mitchell. Garth had also commissioned a memorial garden near the spot where he'd first discovered his mother's journal, with a stone bench and a plaque honoring James's memory. On this particular afternoon, he was expecting visitors. Sarah Palmer, the historian who had helped him begin his investigation, was bringing a group of students from the University of Oklahoma who were studying the Civil Rights era. They wanted to interview Garth about the project and see the places where the story had unfolded. But before they arrived, Garth had some private business to attend to. He walked to the back of the property, to a spot near the creek where the old oak trees provided shade and shelter. This was where, according to his mother's journal, she and James had often met in secret during their brief time together. Garth knelt down and began to dig, using a small spade he'd brought from the garden shed. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, but something in Martha's journal had suggested that James had hidden something here, something he'd wanted to preserve for the future. After digging for about 20 minutes, his spade struck something hard. Carefully, he excavated around the object until he could pull it free. It was a metal box, rusted but still intact, wrapped in what remained of an oilcloth. Inside the box, Garth found a treasure trove of James Mitchell's personal effects. There were more songs, lyrics written on scraps of paper, melodies notated on whatever staff paper James could find. There were letters he'd written to Martha but apparently never sent, filled with declarations of love and dreams for their future together. But most significantly, there was a small recording device, a primitive battery-powered tape recorder that had somehow managed to preserve several of James's performances. The sound quality was poor and the tape was degraded, but Garth could hear his biological father's voice singing songs that no one else had ever heard. One recording in particular made Garth's heart race. It was James singing a lullaby, apparently improvised, directed at his unborn child. "Sleep now, little one, though I may not be here. Know that your daddy loved you more than life itself, my dear. I'll watch over you from wherever souls go, and through the music in your heart, my love will always show. Dream of better days coming, when love wins over hate, when children aren't judged by their parents' fate. You'll have your mama's kindness and your daddy's song, and that's enough to help you be brave and strong." Tears streaming down his face, Garth listened to the entire recording. This was James Mitchell speaking directly to him across 4 decades. A father's love preserved in magnetic tape and buried in Oklahoma soil. It was the most precious gift he could have received. When Sarah Palmer and her students arrived an hour later, they found Garth sitting under the oak trees, the metal box open beside him, still absorbing the emotional impact of his discovery. "Professor Palmer," he said, standing to greet them, "I think I just found the epilogue to James Mitchell's story." The students, a diverse group of young people studying history, music, and civil rights, listened with rapt attention as Garth shared the newly discovered recordings and documents. The lullaby, in particular, moved several of them to tears. "Mr. Brooks," one student asked, "how has this whole experience changed your relationship with your own music? Do you feel like you sing differently now that you know about your biological father's talent?" Garth considered the question carefully. "I think I sing with more purpose now," he said finally. "I understand that music isn't just entertainment. It's memory. It's testimony. It's a way of preserving truth even when the world tries to silence it." James Mitchell's songs survived 40 years underground because music has power that transcends death. Another student, a young black woman majoring in musicology, asked about the responsibility that came with being James Mitchell's son. "Do you feel pressure to represent his legacy in a particular way?" "I feel responsibility," Garth admitted, "but not pressure." James wrote in one of his letters that he hoped his child would find their own path while honoring the past. "I think the best way I can represent his legacy is to live authentically, to use whatever platform I have to tell stories that need telling, and to make sure that music remains a force for bringing people together rather than driving them apart." As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to broader questions about art, identity, and social justice. The students were particularly interested in how Garth planned to use his fame and influence going forward. "The James Mitchell Project was just the beginning," he explained. "There are hundreds, maybe thousands of artists whose work was lost or suppressed because of racism, sexism, homophobia, or other forms of discrimination. I want to help recover those voices, give them the platforms they were denied in their lifetimes." He told them about plans for future projects, collaborations with Native American musicians whose traditions had been suppressed, recordings of songs by women whose contributions to country music history had been overlooked, partnerships with LGBTQ+ artists who had been forced to hide their identities. "Music is the closest thing we have to a universal language," Garth said. "If we can use it to tell the complete story of American culture, not just the sanitized version, but the real story with all its complexity and contradiction, maybe we can help people understand each other better." As the sun began to set over the Oklahoma plains, the students prepared to leave. But before they did, they asked Garth to perform one of James Mitchell's songs. He chose "Oklahoma Wind," the same song that had closed the Ryman concert. But this time, he sang it quietly, intimately, under the trees where his parents had once met in secret. The students sat in a circle around him, their faces reflecting the golden light of the setting sun, and listened as James Mitchell's words floated across the landscape where they had been born. It was a moment of perfect connection, past and present, artist and audience, father and son finally united through the power of song. After everyone had gone, Garth remained by the creek as darkness fell. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this point, from the discovery of his mother's journal to the revelation of his true parentage, from the investigation into James's murder to the recovery of his musical legacy. It hadn't been an easy path. Learning the truth about Raymond's involvement in James's death had been devastating. Dealing with the media scrutiny and public speculation about his identity had been exhausting. But it had also been necessary, because some truths are too important to keep buried. Garth pulled out his phone and scrolled to Marcus Mitchell's number. When his cousin answered, Garth could hear laughter and music in the background. Marcus was at a family gathering, surrounded by the relatives who had embraced Garth as one of their own. "How did it go with the students?" Marcus asked. "Good," Garth replied. "Really good." "And Marcus, I found something else. More recordings, more songs. James left us even more music than we thought." "That's amazing, man. Uncle James just keeps on giving, doesn't he? Even from the grave, he's still sharing his gifts with the world." "Listen," Garth said, "I was thinking about something. What would you say to the idea of opening a music school? Somewhere kids from all backgrounds could come to learn, to develop their talents, to hear stories about artists like James who never got their fair chance?" "I'd say that sounds like exactly what Uncle James would have wanted," Marcus replied without hesitation. He always believed that music could change the world, one heart at a time. They talked for another 20 minutes about the possibilities: a residential music program for talented young people, master classes with established artists, recording opportunities for promising students. It would be expensive and complicated, but with Garth's resources and Marcus's educational experience, it was achievable. After hanging up, Garth walked back to the farmhouse one more time. Tomorrow, he would return to Nashville to begin work on his next album. His own songs this time, but songs informed by everything he'd learned about love, loss, family, and forgiveness. The James Mitchell Project had changed him as an artist and as a person, and that change would be reflected in everything he created going forward. In the living room, he sat down at the old piano and began to play, letting his fingers find melodies that seemed to combine his own musical instincts with the genetic inheritance he'd received from James Mitchell. The music that emerged was neither pure country nor pure blues, but something new, a sound that honored both his fathers while pointing toward a future where such artificial distinctions mattered less. As he played, Garth thought about the complexity of legacy, how we are shaped not just by the people who raise us, but by the people who create us, the people who love us, and even the people who harm us. Raymond Brooks had been both a loving father and a murderer. James Mitchell had been both a victim and a survivor whose art transcended death. Martha Brooks had been both a grieving widow and a woman whose forbidden love had created life. None of them had been simple, and neither was the story they had created together. But it was a true story, and truth, even complicated, painful truth, was always worth telling. The old farmhouse settled around him as he played, its walls no longer holding secrets, but embracing them, integrating them into the larger story of the family that had lived within them. Outside, the Oklahoma wind continued to blow across the plains, carrying with it the echoes of all the voices that had ever sung beneath that vast sky. Voices silenced and voices celebrated, voices forgotten and voices finally remembered. Garth Brooks, son of James Mitchell and Raymond Brooks, child of love and tragedy, heir to both musical greatness and moral complexity, played on into the night. His music carried across the farmland, past the memorial garden where James was honored, over the creek where his body had been found, through the town where he had lived and loved and died. It was music that spoke of redemption and reconciliation, of the possibility that even the darkest chapters of history could be transformed into something beautiful if we had the courage to face them honestly. It was music that proved James Mitchell's faith in the power of song to unite rather than divide, to heal rather than harm, to preserve truth even when truth was dangerous. In the distance, barely audible above the wind, it seemed as though other voices were singing along, the voices of all the artists whose stories had been silenced, whose talents had been buried, whose dreams had been deferred but not destroyed. They were singing together now, a choir of the overlooked and the undervalued, harmonizing across time and space in celebration of the truth that music, like love, is stronger than death. The song continued long into the Oklahoma night, carrying with it the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow. Proof that some stories are too powerful to stay buried forever, and some voices too important to be forgotten. James Mitchell's legacy lived on, not just in the son he had never met, but in every note that celebrated love over hate, truth over silence, and the enduring power of music to transform the world one heart at a time.